I don't know.
Across the Middle East, actions are taking place that prophecy students once believed would remain sealed until the very end. Structures are being organized, authority is being prepared, and ancient frameworks are quietly returning to public view. Scripture did not tell us to panic, but it did command us to pay attention when these patterns emerge. Jesus pointed to unmistakable markers. Daniel outlined their sequence. What was once debated in theory is now unfolding in reality. This is not speculation, it is convergence. The real issue is not timing, but readiness of heart. If this speaks to you, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay watchful as events continue. In the year 70 AD, Jerusalem fell to the Roman army. The destruction was swift, deliberate, and absolute. The Second Temple, the center of Israel's spiritual life, was burned to the ground. But what vanished that day was far more than stone and gold. An entire system was erased. With the temple destroyed, the priesthood could no longer function. Without priests, sacrifices immediately ceased. Without sacrifices, the temple system described throughout Scripture came to a complete halt. Worship did not simply change form, it stopped altogether. The rituals, the offerings, the annual Day of Atonement, and the entry of the high priest into the Holy of Holies, all ended in a single generation. Scripture never presents this system as symbolic or optional. Daniel speaks of sacrifices being stopped in the midst of a specific prophetic period. Jesus warns of a future event taking place in the holy place itself. The Apostle Paul describes worship being interrupted and desecrated. All three describe events that require the same conditions: a temple, active sacrifices, and an operating priesthood. When that system disappeared, a portion of prophecy could not continue. History moved forward, empires rose and fell, but the specific sequence described in Scripture was effectively paused. For nearly 2,000 years, the absence of the temple system placed the prophetic timeline in suspension, waiting for conditions to return. And that long pause is what makes the present moment impossible to ignore. Biblical prophecy does not move randomly. Throughout Scripture, fulfillment is always preceded by preparation. Conditions appear first, often quietly, long before their meaning is fully understood. That pattern is essential to recognize, because the return of the prophetic system did not happen all at once. It happened step by step. The first condition to return was Israel itself. For nearly 1,900 years, there was no Jewish nation. The people of Israel were scattered across the world with no land, no sovereignty, and no capital. According to Scripture, without a nation, there could be no covenantal timeline. Yet in 1948, against overwhelming political and military odds, Israel was reborn. What had seemed historically impossible became a documented fact. The prophetic clock gained its first foundation. The second condition was Jerusalem. After 1948, Israel existed, but Jerusalem did not fully belong to it. The old city, where the temple once stood, remained outside Jewish control. That changed in 1967 during the Six-Day War. In a matter of days, Jerusalem was reunified, and the Temple Mount returned to Jewish authority. Daniel's prophecies repeatedly center on the holy city. Without Jerusalem, they cannot unfold. With its return, another condition quietly locked into place. The third condition was the priesthood. Scripture is precise. Priests cannot be appointed casually. They must come from the tribe of Levi, from the line of Aaron. For decades, organizations like the Temple Institute have worked to identify these descendants through preserved genealogical records. These men are not being trained for symbolic reenactments or museum demonstrations. They are trained for real service learning prayers, procedures, and rituals untouched since antiquity. The fourth condition followed naturally. The temple vessels, the golden menorah, the altar, the table of showbread, silver trumpets, priestly garments, each recreated according to the specifications given in Exodus. These are not artistic replicas. They are functional instruments, crafted to be used. None of this happened suddenly. There were no announcements to the world, no countdown clocks. Just steady, deliberate restoration, piece by piece. Pause for a moment and consider how many of these conditions already exist. At this point, pause for a moment. How many of these conditions did you expect to see fulfilled in our lifetime? For centuries, biblical prophecy did not fail because of war, politics, or disbelief. It paused for a far quieter reason. According to Numbers chapter 19, ritual purification is not symbolic. It is mandatory. No priest may serve without it. No sacrifice may be offered without it. No temple system can function unless purification has taken place. Scripture leaves no room for flexibility here. This requirement stands outside emotion, tradition, or modern reinterpretation. And at the center of that purification stands one of the rarest requirements in all of Scripture: the red heifer. Not any animal, not a symbolic offering, a living, physical creature with conditions so specific that history itself struggled to produce one. Completely red, no blemish, never yoked, never put to work. Not a single hair of another color. Jewish tradition records that only 9 such heifers existed from the time of Moses until the destruction of the Second Temple. 9 across more than 1,000 years. After 70 AD, none appeared. Empires rose and fell. Religions spread across continents. Technology advanced beyond imagination. Yet, this single requirement remained unmet, not because of resistance, but because of rarity. Breeding programs failed. Near-perfect candidates disqualified themselves with the growth of a single dark hair. For centuries, the absence of the red heifer quietly froze the entire system. Without it, priests could not be purified. Without purification, sacrifices could not resume. Without sacrifices, the prophetic sequence described by Daniel could not proceed. It was not dramatic. It was absolute. That is why what happened in 2022 drew attention far beyond agriculture or tradition. 5 red heifers, born not in Israel but in Texas, were identified, examined, and transported to Israel under rabbinical supervision. Their arrival was not celebrated publicly. It was monitored, watched, guarded, because everyone involved understood the stakes. These animals were not symbols. They were conditions. Each heifer entered a period of continuous inspection. Every hair examined, every physical change noted. Disqualification could happen at any moment. And yet, time passed. Growth continued, and some remained qualified. More importantly, they entered the correct age window, described by tradition and law. Old enough, not too old. For the first time in generations, the barrier that had stalled the system for centuries was no longer absolute. This is why attention has shifted so sharply to Jerusalem, not because of rumor, not because of speculation, but because the last condition Scripture explicitly requires is no longer missing. At this point, pause for a moment. For 2,000 years, prophecy did not advance because this one requirement could not be met. And now, it may be. If this moment causes you to stop and reflect, take a second to like the video. Not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that something unprecedented is unfolding. Scripture does not describe the final 7 years as a single continuous experience. It draws a clear dividing line. Halfway through that period, 3.5 years, in everything changes. Up until this point, the world described by prophecy appears stable. Sacrifices are active. Worship resumes. A covenant is in place. Order seems restored, even hopeful. Scripture never denies this appearance. In fact, it explains why many are deceived by it. But Daniel records a moment that interrupts that illusion without warning. In the middle of the week, he writes, "Sacrifices are forcibly stopped, not phased out, not reformed, stopped." This is not a policy shift or a religious disagreement. Scripture presents it as an act of authority imposed against the will of those serving. What had been permitted is suddenly taken away. What was allowed is declared forbidden. And what had been presented as peace is exposed as control. This interruption is not described once. It appears again and again. Across multiple books, written centuries apart, Daniel calls it half of the week. Revelation calls it 42 months. Elsewhere it is named 1,260 days. Still elsewhere, a time, times, and half a time. Different authors, different languages, one duration, 3.5 years. This repetition is deliberate. Scripture is marking a fixed boundary, a turning point so important that it is measured repeatedly to prevent confusion. At this midpoint, something else happens, something Jesus himself emphasized with unusual urgency. He referred back to Daniel and warned that when the abomination of desolation stands where it should not, hesitation becomes dangerous. There is no debate, no analysis, no delay. The instruction is simple: flee. Not because prophecy has failed, but because it has arrived at its most revealing moment. This is why the midpoint is feared. Not because chaos begins immediately, but because deception ends. What had appeared benevolent reveals its true nature. Authority that seemed protective exposes its demand for worship. Peace gives way to coercion. The system no longer asks for participation, it demands allegiance. Paul later describes this same moment, warning that a figure will exalt himself in the holy place, presenting himself as divine. This is not metaphorical language. Scripture treats this as a literal act, with a literal location and a literal consequence. Up until this point, many follow willingly. After this point, neutrality disappears. The final 7 years do not collapse into darkness all at once. They fracture. The first half prepares. The second half confronts. The midpoint divides expectation from reality. This is why Jesus did not warn his followers about the beginning of the 7 years, but about the middle. Because the danger is not when prophecy begins. The danger is when it reveals what has been hidden. If you are still watching at this point, take a moment to reflect on why Scripture returns to this exact moment so often. And if this passage gives you pause, consider sharing your thoughts below. These are not ideas meant to be consumed quickly. The midpoint is not the end of the story. Don't leave yet. What's coming next may change how you understand everything you've seen so far. Stay with us and watch to the very end. Biblical prophecy does not move forward on emotion. It does not respond to fear, excitement, or speculation.